Effectively, we're witnessing a rerun of 2020, only all the parties are a little bit older. How would you respond?
Well, I think this is the rematch that nobody wants. Two old men in various stages of mental decay. You know, if the election were held today, there's no question that Trump would win, probably by as many as 5 points. But the fact is that, you know, it's not going to be held today. It's not for another 10 months. So an awful lot can change.
What are those key factors, Matt? What would you say to Ken are the things we look for?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, one of them, of course, is how Americans feel about the economy, which is always very important and tends to get overlooked, doesn't it, Ken, when we agonize about geopolitics, Ukraine and Gaza and Israel and all that sort of stuff. Although the American economy is doing remarkably well under the circumstances, certainly a lot better than ours, they're not feeling it over there, right? They're still feeling as if they are poor. The cost of living crisis is getting them down, even though the numbers would suggest otherwise. If that feeling persists, then I think Biden, or whoever is the nominee, and I suggest it would be Biden, is going to be in a lot of trouble. So that's really important. I think the other key thing, this has become a real problem for the Democrats, for Biden, is that, and this is where it is to do with Israel and Gaza, there are a lot of Democrats, younger ones or, you know, Arab Americans in a place like Dearborn, Michigan, which has now become a key swing state. They're not going to vote for Trump, but they might not vote at all. They might sit on their hands. And that would be really bad news. Remember, in the 2016 election, it was something like 86,000 votes spread over 3 swing states. That's basically Fulham, right? Maybe Fulham and Hammersmith, that voted for Trump, and they swung the election for him. So it doesn't take a lot in a 50-50 electoral environment to swing it for the other side.
Ken, what are you picking up in the US about where President Biden finds himself with Israel?
Well, I think where he finds himself with Israel is where he finds himself with everything else vis-a-vis Trump. You know, it's a contest between weakness and strength. But you know, Biden is perceived as having been weak on the economy, even though the economy is doing quite well. People don't feel good about it because prices, the cost of living is so much higher than when he came into office. And it is true that inflation is coming down, but that doesn't mean prices are coming down. It just means they're going up at a slower pace. So that's one area of weakness. He's perceived as being weak on the issue of security at the southern border with all the illegal immigrants that have crossed over. And he is now being perceived as weak on in the issue of wars because you have Ukraine and Israel. And, you know, Biden is under pressure, particularly from the left wing of the party, of the Democratic Party, over his strong support of Israel. I saw a poll the other day among young Democrats who said that more than 51% of them thought that Israel should not exist. I mean, it's scary stuff.
Well, Matt, you referenced that, and I picked up on when you said you think Biden will be the Democrat. Well, I did make a note of that. Yeah, you said it at the start.
And I noticed you making a note of it. I think it's important, and I wonder what Ken thinks of that as well. I mean, I think he is probably going to be the nominee. He thinks he should be the nominee, and he thinks that in part because he thinks he's the only person who could beat Donald Trump. Now, let's say by some act of, you know, divine intervention, Donald Trump decides actually he's going to spend all his time on the golf course or in court for that matter. And we have to mention the legal proceedings as well, of which there are many, and not run, which I think is highly unlikely. But if he were to do that, and someone like Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, former Trump ambassador at the UN, were to step in, then I think actually all those people are being very polite to Joe at the moment, saying, of course, Mr. President, you should run again. They might say, you know, mate, it's time to retire. But I think on Trump, I mean, we must not forget the fact that he's facing not one case, but 4 cases, some of them stronger than others. But the day before Super Tuesday, when 15 American states vote in their so-called primaries to decide on who the nominee should be in the Republican Party, the day before, he will appear in court, unless there's some delay, which is unlikely at the moment, in Washington, D.C., effectively trying to stage a failed coup. Now, that's not great. But the American public is extraordinarily tolerant, or rather his base. And I remind you, if I may, Nick,
of course,
the greatest enemy of Donald Trump in any election campaign or in office or in business is called Donald Trump.
Yes, yeah. Let's get Ken back in. Ken, we haven't yet touched on the president's age. You know the British newspaper market as well as you know the US. That would be the stuff of cartoons and late-night chat shows and everything else. How is it going down across the United States? We have a man who I think is going to be, he's just turned 81, I believe.
Well, I think most people think that Biden is too old to do the job, and certainly too old to do a second term. And that's one of the intriguing scenarios that I see that possibly might unfold, that Biden might indeed be confronted by opinion polls sometime in the spring, which show that he has absolutely no chance of winning the election. I mean, it's a suicide mission. And he does agree to step aside. It's not a big possibility that could happen, but it definitely is a possibility. And that would upend the whole election, because presumably he'd be replaced by a candidate at the convention who would be much younger, someone in their 40s or 50s. And then suddenly Trump would be the old man in the race, right? So, you know, as I say, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Biden's going to drop out, because he's worked all his life to be president and he doesn't want to give it up. But, you know, he may be faced with reality that there's just no way he can win.
Let's bring Matt
I think that's a very good point. And, you know, never underestimate the power of elderly men, and perhaps even some women, to think that they're indispensable to whatever they do, right? I wouldn't know anyone like that, of course. But I mean, I think that is very much the case for Biden. He thinks that he's indispensable to not just the presidency, but also saving democracy from autocracy. I think that's very much his gig. I think his wife, Jill, is telling him, I'm told by my sources in Washington, that this is the case indeed, that he is indispensable to American democracy being upheld. And of course, you could argue that he's got a point, because it did look pretty ropey back in 2020 when Trump refused to accept the result. But the fact that in a nation of 335 million souls, right, or whatever it is these days, we are down to two political parties, one of which is hostage to a man who could well be a convict at the end of the year, and the other is hostage to the cardiovascular system of an 82-year-old who, frankly, makes 82 look really, really old. And I know plenty of 81, 82-year-olds who are a lot more sprightly than Mr. Biden.
Ken, Matt has rightly referenced the court issues that Donald Trump is facing. How does that play to his core vote, in your view?
Well, he faces, I believe, 90-plus felony charges. It's like every additional felony charge just seems to strengthen him among the core. I mean, you know, Trump's core thinks that the Democrats have weaponized the judicial system. All these cases against him are pure politics. There's no reality to them, and they're like, just bring it on. I mean, Trump actually fundraises off these charges.
It's absolutely right. I mean, it's a bit like sort of rewording that Stalin dictum, you know, one death is a tragedy and a million deaths are a statistic. I mean, Trump has always, I think, benefited from the ubiquity of outrage. You know, where do you look? There's so many scandals around him. Now there are so many court cases. And of course, he's saying, I'm the Alexei Navalny of American politics. I'm a political prisoner here. And to some extent, some of the charges, especially the ones in New York, for instance, leveled against him. I mean, on one level, they seem like a bit of a political campaign. They're probably not going to, you know, I mean, dare I speak out of turn here, but I doubt that would result in a conviction. This is about paying hush money to a former porn star. But the fact that someone is accused of paying hush money to a former porn star, you know, is actually would in itself, in a normal world, in the past, have basically disqualified you from running for local councillor in Las Vegas, right? But here's a guy who's got that as his least offensive, least serious charge. And it shows you that Trump has brilliantly, you know, kind of almost with a kind of evil genius, turned all these things that are leveled against him into potential assets. The question is, although they are undoubtedly assets with his electoral base in the Republican Party, are they assets enough to swing those crucial, you know, 10,000 votes in this swing state there or this swing state over here in order to vote for him and see someone who could be a convict of being in the Oval Office? But again, I have to say it, the best chance this guy has of getting out of jail is to get into the White House, and that in itself is absurd.